Hello and welcome back to Voyage of a Time Wanderer. Today I am here to do a Q&A video. So I am back to do the Q&A video that I promised in celebration of reaching 500 subscribers. Thank you all so much for leaving all the wonderful, thoughtful, insightful questions. I've had so much fun over the last week pondering all my answers to the questions. And as you can see, I have quite a stack of books here to talk about. There are so many books that I wanted to reference. I've kind of ransacked my shelves for all of my favorite books to answer different questions. And so this is probably going to be a pretty long video. I'm going to try to put timestamps in the description box so you can skip ahead to different questions that you're interested in. And I'm also going to sort the questions. We're going to start with the bookish questions and then slowly move into the more personal life questions. So that is the plan for this video, and I won't take too long to introduce it because it's going to be long enough just answering everyone's questions, and I need to move this stack of books off my couch before it falls. And I have my questions here on my laptop. So the first question actually was asked by two people. So Grace asked me, what classics authors do you enjoy reading the most? And Lisa asked me, who are your favorite Victorian authors and what is a favorite book from each author? So I will kind of answer this together. So for Victorian classics authors, I love Elizabeth Gaskell, and my favorite book of hers is Wives and Daughters, and that is very closely followed by Mary Barton. I love Mary Elizabeth Braddon, and my favorite book of hers that I've read so far is Lady Audley's Secret, which is one of my all-time favorite Victorian classics. I've enjoyed most of the Charles Dickens that I've read, with my favorite being A Tale of Two Cities and Bleak House. Anne Bronte is my favorite of the Brontes, and I really enjoyed The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, and it's one that I would like to reread now that I've read more Victorian classics, because I read it closer to the beginning of my kind of journey with Victorian literature. And then Anthony Trollope is someone who I have started reading more recently, and I've really enjoyed his Barchester Chronicles, the books that I've read in that series so far, with my favorite being the most recent one that I finished, Dr. Thorne. And then for classics authors that aren't Victorian, of course we have Jane Austen, and I want to be edgy and pick a Jane Austen that isn't Pride and Prejudice as my favorite, but the truth is Pride and Prejudice is my favorite Jane Austen. I think my second favorite is Sense and Sensibility. I also, of course, love Lucy Maud Montgomery, her Anne series with Anne of Green Gables and Arilla of Ingleside being my favorite, and then for her adult fiction, I highly recommend The Blue Castle. Elizabeth von Arnim is another 20th century classics author that I've recently started reading and really enjoying. The Enchanted April is one of my favorite books of all time, and I've recommended it to a few people who've really enjoyed it as well. But I also read last year Elizabeth and Her German Garden, and I'm going to continue reading through her work now in publication order. And then Daphne du Maurier is another classics author that I absolutely love. I've read two of her books now, Rebecca and My Cousin Rachel, which were both 5-star reads that had me absolutely on the edge of my seat with the tension building. She's a masterpiece at creating that gothic atmosphere that I really enjoy. So those are my favorite classics authors and my favorite Victorian classics authors and some of my favorite books by them. So my next question comes from Monica, and that is, what are your favorite books that were written in another language and then translated into English? This is a bit of a stumper of a question for me because I don't read as much translated fiction as I probably could and maybe should. And also I couldn't find a way on Goodreads to sort books by original language, so it was kind of a puzzle to try to figure out what books that I had read that maybe I didn't even know were translated. So if anyone knows a way on Goodreads or Storygraph to sort books by original language, that would be very helpful. But the titles that came to mind most easily were obviously classics that I know are classics that aren't from an English-speaking country. So my very favorite piece of translated fiction is the Kristin Lavransdatter trilogy by Sigrid Undset. This is originally written in Norwegian, and Sigrid Undset won the Nobel Prize for Literature for this book series, so that you know it's got the global stamp of approval with winning that major award. But this is an absolutely beautifully written trio of books that follow Kristen from her childhood into her old age, and she's living in medieval Norway, and we really get to see the breadth of human emotion in these books, and I think that's why I love it so much. There's also a strong emphasis on Kristen's faith and how that impacts her life and kind of her journey of redemption from some initial mistakes that she makes. I've also read and enjoyed some French classics. I've read The Black Tulip by Alexandre Dumas, The Hunchback of Notre Dame by Victor Hugo, and Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne. And I'm also starting my journey with Russian classics and have really enjoyed what I've read so far there. So I just finished reading Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, and I've also read White Nights by Fyodor Dostoevsky. So those were the classics that kind of instantly came to mind because I know that they are French classics or Russian classics. But I did dig into my read books and I found a couple that I really enjoyed that are translated. So I have two books that I read that were originally written in French. The first is the graphic memoir series Persepolis, which follows the author's childhood and adolescence growing up in Iran during the time of their revolution. And another book that I read last year that actually almost made it onto my favorite fiction books was At Night, All Blood is Black by David Diop. And this is a really hauntingly written account of a Senegalese soldier in the First World War. And if you read my 2022 fiction favorites, you'll also know that I read Loris by Eugene Vodolazkin last year, which is a contemporary Russian book, which was translated into English. And that was a book that I found really challenging, but really rewarding at the same time. So I did also pull two books off of my endless TBR behind me that are translated books that I would like to get to at some point soon. The first is A Man Called Ove by Fredrik Backman. This book was originally written in Swedish, I believe, and it's one of those ones that so many people have recommended to me, but I haven't got around to picking up yet for some reason. And then the other is the My Brilliant Friend trilogy by Elena Ferrante, which is originally written in Italian and translated. I believe this is a trilogy or maybe a set of 4 books that follows two girls kind of from their childhood and then up into their adult years. And this is a book that I've heard a lot of people really enjoy, but I've also seen some negative reviews for, so it's definitely one that I am curious to form my own opinion about. Then I had 2 people ask me about my favorite Canadian authors. So Faye asked me who are some of your favorite Canadian authors, and Elizabeth asked which Canadian authors do you love and would recommend. So I did do a video maybe 2 years ago now called Canadian Authors I Love and Want to Read More By, so I'll link that one in the description because that was a video where I picked 5 Canadian authors that I've only read 1 book from, but like absolutely loved that 1 book and want to read more of their catalog. So that's an idea about some of the Canadian authors I would recommend. If I could put one Canadian author's books in the hands of everyone who watches my videos, that would be Stuart McLean. Stuart McLean was an absolutely incredible Canadian. He hosted a long-running radio program called The Vinyl Cafe that we used to listen to when I was growing up. Like every single Sunday we would listen, and as part of that radio show he would perform a short story that he had written about a family living in Toronto. The parents are Dave and Morley, and they have 2 children. And this series of short story collections are absolutely like so heartwarming, nostalgic, laugh out loud funny. Some of the stories in these collections are tearjerkers, and then some of them you will be laughing so hard you can't breathe. I think the second book is my favorite. It's Home from the Vinyl Cafe, and one of the things I love about it is it's separated by seasons. So we have a couple short stories for winter, spring, summer, autumn, and then winter again because it's Canada, so winter really should count as 2 seasons. And this has some of my favorite stories. So Dave Cooks a Turkey is an absolute holiday classic. We had this story individually on CD, and we used to listen to it like every Christmas. It's the story of what happens when Dave promises Morley that he will be in charge of cooking the Christmas turkey and then forgets about it until like Christmas Eve, Christmas morning, and realizes he has no clue what he's doing. Holland is one of those tearjerker stories. It's from Dave and Morley's early courtship. and they decide to go on an impromptu trip to the Netherlands to skate on the canals, and the descriptions of them skating on the canals in the Netherlands is absolutely beautiful. We've got Sourdough, which is one of those hilarious stories where Dave is babysitting his neighbor's sourdough starter and it goes terribly wrong. Bird is a story about what happens when a rare bird is spotted in Dave's backyard, and kind of all the birders of the East Coast descend on this backyard to try to spot this rare bird. We've got Road Trip, where they try to take their cat on a road trip with predictably hilarious results. And then On the Roof, where Dave is up on his roof putting up his Christmas lights and is filled with an irresistible urge to see if his tongue would really stick to metal. So Stuart McLean is definitely my favorite Canadian author, but he has written only short stories. So for regular fiction, obviously we have again Lucy Maud Montgomery. She is a classic for a reason, and I think she's one of the Canadian authors that is most read outside of Canada. Lawrence Hill is another of my very favorite Canadian authors. So The Book of Negroes I first read in grade 12, and this is historical fiction set during the time of the American Revolution, and it follows the story of Aminata, who is one of the Black Loyalists who came up to Nova Scotia with the evacuation of the Loyalist refugees, and we follow her entire life from childhood into slavery through the American Revolution to Nova Scotia, where she lives in the emerging Africville town, and then she also travels back to Africa to be part of the founding of Sierra Leone, and then to the UK, where she works in the abolition movement. So it's like one of those globally sweeping stories, and I also read it at least once, studied it at least once in university in an African studies class, and it's one of those books that has meant so much to me at different times in my life that now I'm afraid to reread it, lest I don't enjoy it as much as I do in my memory, because it is a book that I would consistently say is one of my very favorites. And then a more well-known Canadian author is Emily St. John Mandel, who now lives in the States but grew up in Canada on a small Gulf island kind of near where I grew up. So from her, I have read her Station 11 trilogy, loosely a trilogy, Station 11, The Glass Hotel, and Sea of Tranquility. All three of these books are kind of loosely linked. It's not really directly a trilogy, but I would definitely recommend reading all three in publication order to get the most out of each story. So she is another contemporary Canadian author that I've really enjoyed. And then with Middle Grade March coming up, I also want to give a shout out to two of my favorite Canadian children's authors that I don't think get enough recognition here on Booktube, and they are Kit Pearson and Jean Little. So Kit Pearson wrote the Guests of War trilogy, which were some of my favorite books growing up that I read over and over again, and this follows the story of two British home children who were evacuated to Canada during the Second World War. Another of my childhood favorite titles from her was Awake and Dreaming. She also wrote one of the Dear Canada Diaries, which was a series of books that I absolutely devoured as a child. And then Jean Little also wrote, I believe, 5 of the Dear Canada books, including one of the first books in the series, which I had received as a gift from my grandmother, which is Orphan at My Door, the Home Child Diary of Victoria Cope, which was set in Ontario in 1897. And I also loved her books Willow and Twig and Stand in the Wind. Stand in the Wind, I feel like if you're a certain age of Canadian girl, you've read this book and you have the phrase stand in the wind and eat peanut brittle like forever emblazed across your heart, and you can't taste peanut brittle without thinking about this Jean Little book. Jean Little was actually blind, and she incorporates her experiences with blindness into a number of the books she wrote, where her characters either deal with low vision or blindness or have other disabilities. And then Elizabeth asked, what are some of your favorite historical fiction novels? And this was very difficult. Historical fiction is my favorite genre, so I had many books that could have made this list, but I tried to narrow it down to a somewhat reasonable list. So we have The Golden Tulip by Rosalind Lacker, which is my very favorite of the Dutch Golden Age historical fiction time period that I love so much. This book follows 3 sisters as they kind of come of age and fall in love. We're following the different ups and downs of their romances, and they're also living in this time period of extreme upheaval in the Netherlands, where we have tulip mania taking place, as well as some burgeoning conflict with France. This book has some serious drama and some moments when you're just not sure how the author is going to resolve all of the threads that she has going, but in the end it is just a thoroughly enjoyable read. Like I mentioned already, The Book of Negroes by Lawrence Hill is one of my favorite historical fiction novels. A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens is both a Victorian classic and a historical fiction novel because it's set during the French Revolution, so it was historical fiction at the time that it was published. Last Christmas in Paris by Hazel Gaynor and Heather Webb, which I did a review video on, is a absolutely beautiful epistolary World War I era novel. And this book follows two childhood friends that promised they would meet again in Paris. So we have the young woman who is staying home on the home front and the young man who has gone off to fight. And so we're kind of following as their friendship develops over the war and slowly becomes more than just a friendship. What Kitty Did Next by Carrie Cabelan is a Pride and Prejudice retelling or Pride and Prejudice continuation that follows the story of Kitty past the end of Pride and Prejudice, and I think, this is a bold statement, but I think that this is my favorite Pride and Prejudice retelling that I've read. I'm hoping in Jane Austen July to do a recap because I've read 5 different Pride and Prejudice retellings now, so I'd love to discuss all of them, but this book was absolutely wonderful. The Mercies by Kieran Millwood Hargrave, which is set in Norway during the 1600s, and just has a really evocative setting. We are following a small fishing village after their entire male population is killed while out fishing when a freak storm sweeps up, and so the women have to learn how to kind of run this village on their own. And when spring comes, a new magistrate arrives who views some of the power that these women have accrued as a sign that there is a witch living in the village that needs to be caught. The Lady of the Rivers by Philippa Gregory. I have loved actually quite a few of Philippa Gregory's books, but this is the first book in her Plantagenet Tudor series, and so it was one of the first books of hers that I read, and I love this cover with the foil leaves. But this book is telling the story of Jaquetta, who is the mother of Elizabeth Woodville, who will become the bride of Edward IV, and she actually grew up in France, I believe. And so there's some parts of this that have Joan of Arc's story, which was kind of a really odd but interesting inclusion that I wasn't expecting in this book series. And it's also just got the faintest touch of magical realism, which I really, really enjoyed. So if you're curious about Philippa Gregory, this would definitely be a great place to start with her. And then last but not least, I have The Pillars of the Earth by Ken Foley. I absolutely love this cover. It's got some foil and then the arch of the cathedral. This is the book that kind of kicked off my love of reading cathedral fiction, and it's also a source of great disappointment for me because I haven't loved the rest of the books in this series as much as I loved this first book. It's a chunker. Like, how many pages is it? 974, my edition. So it's definitely a time investment, but I absolutely tore through this book. I read it on ebook and then picked up a copy at my local secondhand bookstore because I knew it had to be in my collection, but because it was on ebook, I didn't realize quite how large it was, and I read this in just a couple of days. This book is set during the construction of the Kingsbridge Cathedral, and the descriptions of these characters and the thought that they're putting into the architecture behind the cathedral is absolutely stunning. And there's also just a lot of medieval drama and also violence, but a lot of drama. And I'm forever grateful to this book for kicking off my love of cathedral novels. Then Tiffany asked a genre you haven't delved much into but would like to. And there's a couple genres that I have never really read or am just starting to read. The first genre that I would say I have never read but am tentatively interested in are westerns. I've never really read a western that I can remember, but it's a genre that is kind of intriguing. Mostly I just want to read Lonesome Dove, but that is a huge book that's very intimidating, so I have never yet picked it up. But that is a book/genre that intrigues me. If you watched my 2022 fiction favorites, you'll know that I am starting to be interested in exploring sci-fi a little bit more, which is a genre that I thought I wasn't interested in at all. But after reading Sea of Tranquility and A Canticle for Leibowitz and having both end up on my top 10, actually both ended up in my top 5. So after reading those two books last year, I'm thinking that there is a niche of sci-fi that I would really enjoy. So I am picking up more sci-fi titles this year to kind of try to solidify what my interests are in that genre. Particularly, I'm interested in sci-fi that has a strong faith focus or explores how Catholicism has evolved in the future, as well as sci-fi that is like Sea of Tranquility in that it's quite literarily written and has at its heart kind of bigger questions about what it means to be human and kind of this nostalgia for the present that I love so much in St. John Mandle's writing. And then Lisa asked, what book to movie adaptations do you like the most? And as a general principle, I like adaptations of classic novels the most. Like period dramas are what I really enjoy watching. And I'm about to alienate like half of my subscribers by saying that my very favorite book to movie adaptation is the 2005 Pride and Prejudice, which I know is like an extremely controversial opinion, but I absolutely love that movie. I attribute my love for it with really igniting my love for Jane Austen, and as a result of that, my love of classic literature in general. There was one summer when I was taking like extra French classes at a summer language school, and I literally sat and watched that on my old school, not even an iPod Touch, was it an iPod? You know, before the iPod Touch, when there was like the iPod that was kind of this shape that had like the tiny screen, I would sit there and watch Pride and Prejudice on that like 1" by 2" screen every single lunch break. I would just watch however much I could watch and then pick it up the next day and then immediately restart it whenever I finished it. It's still my go-to comfort movie, and the soundtrack is like sonographic perfection. I absolutely love the soundtrack. I think it's so aesthetically pleasing, and I love that it isn't a miniseries so that I can just sit down and watch it within one evening. But then for miniseries, I love the 2009 Emma. I think that might be my favorite Austen adaptation of all time. I think Emma and Mr. Knightley are perfectly cast. The costumes are beautiful. Again, the soundtrack is absolutely stunning. There's some beautiful shots of yearning hands, and I just absolutely love it. And then I'm also partial to the 2008 Sense and Sensibility, mostly because I love the visuals of Moorland Cottage in that movie, with that kind of whitewashed English cottage right on the cliffs overlooking the sea. It is, if I could pick any Austen house to live in, it would be Moorland Cottage because of that movie. And then a few other book to movie or book to miniseries adaptations that I've really enjoyed is, of course, the 2004 North and South, which was kind of my gateway drug into Victorian film adaptations. I remember we got my aunt this miniseries for Christmas one year, and we were literally watching it on a laptop in the back seat of the car, driving her back to the airport to try to finish the last episode before she had to go home. The Miniaturist by Jessie Burton also has an incredible miniseries that was produced in 2017. This is a Dutch Golden Age historical fiction book, and the miniseries actually has both Anna Taylor-Joy and Romola Gary in it, so it's got like the two Emmas from my favorite Emma adaptations in The Miniaturist. But the visuals of 17th century Amsterdam are absolutely beautiful in this miniseries. And then lastly, we have Testament of Youth, which is a little bit unique because it's actually an adaptation of a nonfiction book. It was a memoir that they adapted into her life story. And this is Vera Britton's memoir of her time during the First World War. And this is a movie that I actually watched for the first time on an airplane. And I remember I was like literally sobbing on this airplane. Like, I'm sure my fellow passengers and the people sitting around me, like, what is going on? Has this person like just received tragic news? But no, I was just watching Testament of Youth, and it's a World War I story, so it's obviously got some really sad moments. But visually, this film is like cinematically stunning, and it's a really, really beautiful story at the same time. Then Lisa asked, how do you find the time to read so many books? So reading is my main hobby. So pretty much most of my free time I am reading. I don't really watch very many TV shows or movies unless they're like a really highly recommended book to movie adaptation. But really expanding my reading into ebooks and audiobooks has been a huge game changer for the amount that I can read, because I listen to audiobooks during all kinds of time when previously I wouldn't have been able to read. So maybe when I'm grocery shopping or cleaning or cooking or knitting or sewing, I can have an audiobook on and be reading. Even I've got an exercise bike here in the corner of our living room, and I can be listening to a book while I'm working out. So that was all like previously dead time that I couldn't be reading, that I am now able to read thanks to audiobooks. And then ebooks have also been great because it means anywhere I have my phone, I have my book with me. So if I'm somewhere waiting for an appointment, I can read a couple pages. If I'm on my lunch break at work, or if we're having like a really slow day and I don't have anything to do, I can read. And when I'm in bed and the lights are already off and maybe my husband's fallen asleep and I'm not tired yet, I can read a couple chapters without needing to turn on a light and disturb him. So I think audiobooks and ebooks are really what has enabled me to be able to read so much. Lisa also asked, what are your favorite audiobooks? I did do a video a couple years ago. I think it was my top 5 favorite multicast audiobooks. I'm a real sucker for audiobooks that are multicast because I think it brings the story to life in such a unique way. And it really takes advantage of what is possible with the audiobook format. Some memorable audiobooks from the past year or so. I listened to Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier on Audible, and that was narrated by Anna Massey, and that was an incredible audiobook. I would highly recommend listening to that version if you're interested in picking up Rebecca for the first time. Rosamund Pike narrates Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility, which I absolutely love her as an actress, and having her voice read those books is an absolute treat. I love Juliet Stevenson as a narrator, so I really enjoyed listening to Mary Barton by Elizabeth Gaskell with her narration. I've listened to a lot of classics off of LibriVox, which is a free audiobook website, and I love Mill Nicholson. She does a lot of Victorian classics, particularly Dickens novels, so I listened to her reading of Our Mutual Friend and Bleak House, and she does an absolutely incredible job with the accents and everything to make each character very differentiated, which helps a lot in books like Dickens that have such a large cast of characters. The Maisie Dobb mystery series are another audiobook gem. I've actually done a full video review of the series, which I'll link in the description. But that is a book series where if I'm given the choice, I'll always pick the audiobook over the physical copy because I just love the narrator so much. And then I also loved listening to the Mitford series by Jan Karon. I read most of the books in that series on audiobook, and the narrator there was really special. Particularly one of the things that I liked is that when there were like hymns or Christmas carols interspersed through the book, he would actually sing them, which was just a delight when you're listening along and you suddenly get a little musical interlude. And then Lisa's follow-up question to this was, what speed do you listen to them on? And Lisa and I have buddy read some books, so she knows that I listen to books at quite a quick speed. Usually I will start a book off at 1.75, like I will rarely listen to a book lower than 1.75. Every now and then I find if it is like a memoir narrated by the author, for some reason they seem to speak at a more natural speed than a professional narrator, so in that case it might be like a 1.5. But for most fiction books or nonfiction books that I'm listening to that aren't narrated by the author, I will start at 1.75 and then slowly I'll build up speed as I get more comfortable with that narrator and their speaking style, and usually cap out around 2.5 would be like kind of quick, and then if the narrator was particularly slow, I'd be known to go as fast as 2.5. But most books I'm usually listening around the 2 times speed. And then I have 2 questions about African literature. So Sandra asked, do you have any videos about your African reading journey? And Lisa asked, where is the best place to start reading African literature and or nonfiction? So I don't actually have any videos specifically about African literature or my Reading Africa challenge. I do have on my very old book blog that I started before this Booktube channel, that's where I keep the list of kind of which countries I have read and which books I've read for each country. So I'll link that blog post if you're interested to see which countries I have read from and what books I have read from each country. But I definitely should make some videos about this in the future, so that's a great idea, thank you. But I'll share some of my favorites, fiction favorites and non-fiction favorites. So for fiction favorites, my all-time favorite is The Old Drift by Namwali Serpell. I'm kind of biased in picking this book as a favorite because it is a Zambian novel, and there's not very much Zambian fiction out there, so reading this was a pretty incredible experience because it had so much that I could relate to from my time in Zambia, and then that my husband even could relate to. I listened to this one on audiobook when I read it. There was this moment where the characters were singing a political campaign song from the 90s, and the audiobook narrator was actually singing this song, and so I played it back for my husband, and he was like, yes, that's exactly the song, and he started singing along. So the fact that the narrator, the fact that the author went to the effort to find the exact campaign song lyrics, and then that the narrator would take the time to actually find out what the tune was and sing it accurately, despite knowing that a lot of people wouldn't pick up on that. Like, those are the kind of details that they put into this book that make it such a special reading experience. Even the description of the airport in Lusaka, like the color of the walkway canopies, was accurate. So this book was just really special to read, to have so many little facets of life in Zambia represented. But it's also just a really fascinating multi-timeline, multi-character historical fiction novel. It's got a family tree at the beginning, which is always a good sign for me because I love like multi-generational stories. And so we're following 3 different families across 3 generations that are all interconnected in different ways. And this book is just really unique and really special. It's a little bit Dickensian. It's got some magical realism. It's got kind of this Greek chorus of mosquitoes that is in between each part. And there's even a tiny bit of sci-fi at the very end. So we're starting in the late 1800s and going up all the way into the near future. And this is my very favorite African lit that I have read to date. I've also really enjoyed Half of a Yellow Sun by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, which is set during the Biafran War in Nigeria. Homegoing by Ya Jassy, which I think a lot of people have read because it was a really popular release a couple years ago. And this is another multi-generational, multi-timeline book, which is following 2 different diverging family paths. One sister is captured and brought into slavery in the United States, and so we're following her family's story from being enslaved people up into the different struggles that Black Americans have faced. And then the other sister's family stayed in Ghana, and we're following their stories through colonization by the British, and then Ghanaian independence, and kind of going through the 19th and 20th century of Ghana's history from their perspective. I also loved The Poisonwood Bible by Barbara Kingsolver, and this is set in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, right as that country is achieving its independence, and we are following a family of American missionaries as their ill-fated attempts to convert the locals go kind of predictably sideways, and it's kind of a real critique on white saviorism. And then lastly, we have The Death of Comrade President by Alan Banku, and this is a really unique story set in Congo-Brazzaville at a critical moment in the country's history when their president is assassinated, and we're seeing this event through the eyes of a young boy who it's fairly autobiographical. It's not autobiographical, it's fiction, but there's a lot of similarities between this boy and his story and the author. And really all this boy cares about is that his dog has gone missing in kind of the general hubbub and commotion of this news breaking that the president has died and that there has been a coup attempt. And so while the adults in his world are caught up in the political mayhem, our main character, this young boy, is searching for his missing dog. And this book takes place over quite a compressed timeline. The whole book is written over the course of like 3 or 4 days, which is a literary style that I always enjoy. And then for nonfiction, kind of African literature related nonfiction, there's 2 titles that I would really recommend. The first is The Life of Olaudah Equiano, or Gustavus Vassa the African. This is kind of a classic piece of African literature nonfiction. It was originally published in 1789 as kind of a growing body of publications that were part of the abolitionist movement. Different narratives of people's experiences with slavery that were being published to try to raise awareness among people about what the living conditions were actually like, especially for people that weren't living directly in areas that had plantations where they could witness this firsthand. So this book is Olata Equiano's whole life story, starting from his childhood in West Africa, through his capture and enslavement, and then through his numerous attempts to buy his freedom. It's a really incredible story. I studied it in university, hence the sticky notes, but he ends up traveling the world on a Royal Navy ship, which were really interesting to read about, and it is kind of a seminal piece in abolitionist literature. And then I also really enjoyed Born a Crime, which is Trevor Noah's memoir of his childhood growing up in South Africa in a time when relationships between white and black people were illegal. And so being visibly biracial, he was kind of living proof of this crime that his parents had committed by being involved with each other. So he wasn't really free for a lot of his childhood to move around, and spent a lot of time indoors and kind of out of sight. And couldn't go out with both of his parents and enjoy kind of normal childhood activities. This is another book that I listened to on audiobook, and it was narrated by Trevor himself, and it was an absolutely wonderful listening experience. So I would highly recommend this as a great place to start with African nonfiction. Then Faye asked, do you have any favorite bookmarks or book-related trinkets that you could show us? And I don't really have any bookmarks to show off because, to be honest, like a lot of my reading is done either on ebook or audiobook, so I think about 75% of the books that I read are not read physically, so I don't use bookmarks very often, and then when I do, I usually am using like the bookmarks that are included with my purchase from my local bookstore or from Book Depository, or an index card or receipt or whatever. But I do have a couple trinkets that I would love to show. The first is this Baker Street sign that I got at the Sherlock Holmes Museum in London. So this is a little replica of what the street signs look like in the UK, and it is based off of Sherlock Holmes' address, 221B Baker Street. So that is a little fun sign that I like to have up on my bookshelf. I also have this wonderful Jane Austen bust planter. It actually says Jane Austen along the bottom here, and it's got kind of her little hairstyle, and then the plant is growing out of the top of her head. So this is really fun to have on my bookshelf near my Jane Austen books. And then I also have this proudly standing since 1599 pin, which I got at the Globe Theatre, and this is a reference to the groundlings at Globe Theatre performances, which were like the cheapest tickets you could buy, where you would stand and watch the performance. And so when I went to the Globe Theatre while I was in London, I was a groundling. We stood and watched Julius Caesar, and I got this little pin to commemorate my experience, and I keep it on my classic shelf near my Shakespeare books. Then Tiffany asked, what would your ideal reading day look like? And this was fun to imagine. I think it would definitely be a summer day, so I would probably sleep in and then read in bed for a bit and have a leisurely morning where I'm just enjoying lying in bed and reading whatever book I had on the go, and then eating a late brunch with my husband, and then heading out to the lake, which is our favorite summer activity. When it's really hot, there's just nothing better than going to the lake and going for a swim. And then I've started to really love listening to audiobooks at the lake. I always had a trouble bringing books to the lake because it was just hard to read. There would be this glare from the sun, your hands are kind of damp and getting the pages wet, there's sand getting into your book. But since I started listening to more audiobooks, there's nothing more relaxing than like putting your sunglasses on, putting your hat on, closing your eyes, and just listening to an audiobook and enjoying being outside and listening to that story unfold without having to worry about the sun glare. And then I would probably finish out the day with a Blizzard from Dairy Queen and watching a book-to-movie adaptation that I had been anticipating watching. So I think that that would be my ideal reading day. And then Monica asked, what is a book that you love but nobody else seems to? And so for this I went onto Goodreads and sorted my favorite shelf by rating to find out what my favorite books were that had the lowest rating. and the lowest rated book that I had given a 5-star is The Anatomy Lesson by Nina Segal, which has a 3.51 rating. I actually read this book back in 2017 when I was just getting into Dutch Golden Age historical fiction, and it was also, I think, my first ever audiobook. And so I was a little bit swept away by both of these experiences of reading this historical fiction set in a time period that I love so much now, and then also realizing how much I loved audiobooks through this experience. So it would kind of be interesting, I'm wondering, did I rate it too highly? Like, why does it only have a 3.51? I would be very curious to go back now and reread it now that I am a seasoned audiobook listener and have also read a lot of Dutch Golden Age historical fiction. But this story is centered around Rembrandt's The Anatomy Lesson portrait and is kind of telling the story of the different characters in this painting and characters that aren't in the painting but would have been part of the moment that was captured in the painting. And I just love books that are centered around famous paintings. So I really love this book, but it only has a 3.5 on Goodreads. So apparently a lot of people didn't enjoy it as much as I did. And then for nonfiction, Before and After by Alison Wilson is quite low rated. It looked like it only had a 3.4. And I explained some of the reasons why in my 2022 nonfiction favorites video. This is a book that I think a lot of people picked up after watching the miniseries Mrs. Wilson, and then were disappointed by how much faith content was in this, because it's really more of a religious memoir, whereas the miniseries focuses more on the drama of her marriage. So I can see why a lot of people were disappointed when they picked up this book, but as someone who does enjoy faith memoirs and religious books, it was a wonderful read for me. And that bridges us into the last two questions of the bookish section of this Q&A, which are both related to religious reading. And so I have a question from Elizabeth. What are some Catholic specific books you have loved and have been helpful for you in your faith? And the author that immediately comes to mind for that is Scott Hahn. I absolutely love Scott Hahn's writing. He's able to convey so much theological wisdom in such a brilliant way while being completely accessible. I just love his writing style, and I've learned so much from his books. A few of my favorites of his that I own have been The Lamb's Supper, The Mass as Heaven on Earth, which is a book where he kind of unpacks the symbolism behind different parts of the Mass and relates that to the book of Revelation. Hail Holy Queen, the Mother of God in the Word of God, which is all about Mariology. And then this book, which isn't really written by him, it's more compiled or edited by him, and that is Living the Mysteries, a Guide for Unfinished Christians, which is a devotional that starts at Easter and ends at Pentecost. And each week features a different father of the church. And so we have a little, for example, this is week 4, it's St. Ambrose of Milan, and all of the readings for this week were about the Eucharist. And so Scott Hahn does a little introduction about kind of the life of that father of the church, and then each day has a little bit of explanation, and then it's a quote, like an extended quoted passage from that church father's writings, and then some prayer prompts, a memorization section, and then kind of some application. So I found this book absolutely fascinating when I read it, and I learned so much about the early church father writings in such an accessible way because it was broken down into these thematic weeks with small sections each day. And then another Catholic author that I absolutely love is Brant Petra. I've read 2 of his books, Jesus and the Jewish Roots of the Eucharist and Jesus and the Jewish Roots of Mary. And you can see by my tabs, my little blue tabs and yellow tabs, just how well loved and informative I found these books. Brant Petra is a university professor that focuses on kind of early biblical history and how Jewish traditions were incorporated into the practices of the early church. And so I have found his writings on both the Eucharist and on Mary to be very illuminating and to have answered some questions that I had in my mind, as well as kind of explaining some of the history or tradition behind different practices. And then Read of God by Carol Houselander is an absolutely beautiful book. I would highly recommend it as an Advent read. It's really about the role of Mary and how we can emulate Mary in accepting Christ into our lives. It's absolutely beautifully written. I read it on Kindle and I highlighted so many sections of that book, and it's definitely one that I will reread in the future and would like to eventually pick up a physical copy of. And then kind of related, Amanda asked, can you recommend a nonfiction book on the church? And so for this, I'm going to recommend two nonfiction books that are more like classic nonfiction rather than theological nonfiction. So not like a theology book, but actual nonfiction about different aspects of the church. Both of these were actually made it on my top 5 nonfiction reads of 2021, so I'll link that video down below. So the first is The Vatican Prophecies by John Thavis. The author was a reporter in the Vatican for a long time, and so he has lots of interesting insight and inside connections. And the subtitle for this book is Investigating Supernatural Signs, Miracles, and Prophecies in the Modern Age. And I really enjoyed this book, particularly the portions that dealt with the path to sainthood. I learned a lot about what goes into an investigation into whether or not someone should be declared a saint, and kind of how the miracles attributed to those saints are authenticated and verified. And then the other nonfiction book is The Church of Spies, The Pope's Secret War Against Hitler by Mark Riebling. This is all about the activities of Pope Pius XII during the Second World War, and he is someone who has been sometimes criticized for not doing enough to stand up to Hitler, but as more and more documents are being declassified as time goes on, people are learning more about a lot of the secret initiatives that he had going on, both to help Jewish people hide and escape in the Vatican, but also how he was intimately involved in a number of plots to assassinate Hitler. And so this book dives into all of that and was absolutely fascinating. So then we have 2 questions that are related to my childhood reading life. Colleen on Instagram asked, what sparked your love of reading? And I have loved reading for as long as I can remember. I learned to read at quite a young age. My mom started teaching me how to read when I was 3 because she was pregnant with my little sister and was worried that once the baby arrived she wouldn't have time to help me learn to read, and also wanted me to be able to occupy myself while she was busy with the baby. So I learned to read when I was about 3 and a half and basically just loved reading ever since then. I was homeschooled through elementary school and middle school, and the curriculum that we used was very literature focused. So I just spent a lot of time in my day-to-day life surrounded by books and reading books. And I loved experiencing history and adventure through the pages of these books. So I don't really have one moment that sparked my love of reading, but it is something that has been such a precious part of my life ever since my early childhood, that has continued to be something that I really enjoy up to the present day. And then Grace asked, what did you enjoy the most when you were little reading? And I think my favorite childhood reading memories are around our Friday trips to the library. So on Fridays we would go to the library and browse around and check out an enormous stack of books. And then we had a homeschool co-op skating group that we would go to. So we would go to the local arena, skate for an hour or so, and then come home and my mom would make hot chocolate. And so we would just get to sit and start reading through our stack of books and drink our hot chocolate. I would always fill up my mug with milk after I finished my cup of hot chocolate, so I could like scrape the hot chocolate dredges and make kind of like a chocolate milk out of my milk, and just spend the whole afternoon tired from skating, enjoying our hot chocolate and reading these books. So that is my favorite childhood reading memory. And as for the types of books that I really enjoyed reading when I was little, it's honestly the same kind of genres that I enjoy reading now, just the child versions of them. So I really liked mysteries. I was really into the Boxcar Children, the Hardy Boys, the Famous Five. Eric Wilson, who wrote a series of Canadian mysteries set in different Canadian cities called the Tom and Liz Austin Mysteries. And then I also loved historical fiction from a young age, particularly like the Dear Canada, Dear America diaries and the Royal Diaries. And then there was also a lot of Tudor fiction that I remember really enjoying as a child. So those are the bookish questions, and now we're getting into more of the personal life questions. Sorry that this is such a long video, but I hope you're enjoying listening to my answers. So Tiffany asked me on Instagram, are you an animal lover? Tell us about your pets if you have any. And I'm definitely an animal lover. I would love to have pets, but sadly, where we live, there are rental restrictions that mean that we're not able to have any pets. I usually have a betta fish. That's kind of my illicit pet that I get away with because I have her in not just a bowl, but a small fish tank, but small enough that it's not a water hazard, I guess, so I'm able to get away with keeping my one betta fish. But my most recent fish was a red female that I called Ruby, and she sadly passed away last fall after about 3 years. So she lived into old age, but then our local pet store has been going under renovations, so I haven't been able to get a replacement. So right now I just have one very happy snail that has a whole fish tank to itself and just enjoys cruising around and cleaning up the algae. But really, I am a dog person at heart. We had a beautiful dog growing up who was a golden retriever, black lab, German shepherd cross, and was just the absolute sweetest dog you will ever meet. I loved her so much, and it will be hard for any dog to ever measure up to how perfect she was. And then we also had a dog in Zambia that I think was probably some sort of mini schnauzer mix. But sadly, we weren't able to bring that dog with us because the immigration process of bringing pets from Zambia to Canada was just a little bit too complicated. So he is happily living with cousins, and we do get photo updates every now and then. But one day, if we ever do buy a house of our own, we would love to have a dog again. And then Dana asked me kind of a two-part on genealogy. So the first question is, how long have you been researching your genealogy? And I always grew up in a family that loved to tell stories about the old days. So I definitely grew up with an awareness of my family history, but I started my own serious genealogy research in February 2013, so I guess exactly 10 years ago now, as a result of an assignment that I was given in a military history class at university. We were given the choice of, instead of writing like a traditional paper, we could write a fictionalized account of a soldier's experience in a Canadian conflict if we went to the Canadian archives and pulled their service record and used that as a primary source to inform our fictional story. And so I chose a great-grand-uncle, and as soon as I was touching those original historical documents at Libraries and Archives Canada, I was hooked, and I have been doing genealogy research ever since. I love the detective work that goes into genealogy research, of piecing together someone's life from the records that you can find, and hunting down clues in all kinds of different record sources. And then I also love deep diving into social history of the time period and the place where they lived to fill in more of the details in my mind about what their life would have been like that I can't just learn from their basic birth, marriage, death records. And then the second part of Dana's question is, are there any books that you would recommend for someone who loves genealogy? And this was kind of hard for me because I haven't read very many like pure genealogy nonfiction books. I think genealogy is a field that is evolving so quickly as more and more record groups come online and are digitized, that at least I find that if I pick up a book on like how to do Scottish genealogy, for example, by the time our library buys it and I pick it up and read it, and maybe it's 5 years old, like already a lot of the websites will have changed, or there are entire new record sets online that I have access to now that I wouldn't have had when the time the book was published. So I find a lot of the how-to books go out of date very quickly, and so I prefer to get my information off of blogs and Facebook groups and webinar workshops, like recordings on YouTube. But what I would really recommend, and what I have thoroughly enjoyed doing, is making your own reading lists based off of the times and places where your ancestors were from, and that's the entire concept behind my Reading Through My Family Tree series. So I'll link that playlist below so you can see all of the videos that I've done in that style. But it's been really fun to choose a handful of fiction and nonfiction books that are really unique to the places and time periods where my ancestors lived. Maybe a book of folk tales from the small Scottish Isle where my Scottish roots are from, or a book about a specific profession. Like one of my great-great-grandfathers was a laborer in the oil fields in Italy in the Victorian era, and so I have a book about what the early oil fields were like. So if you're interested in genealogy and want to find books like that, I would really recommend kind of curating your own TBRs based off of your own family, because every family's story is so unique. But there are like local history books out there that are linked to very, very small towns that would be an absolute treasure trove for information about your family. And there's also fictional books set in the time period or the place that will bring that social history and kind of atmosphere to life in a really special way. But there are two nonfiction books that I have really enjoyed that I think anyone who enjoys genealogy research would like, whether or not it's specifically linked to their family roots. The first is Ancestor Trouble by Maud Newton, which was on my 2022 nonfiction favorites video. And this book is about someone in America investigating their family roots back about 3 generations in the American South. But she breaks up her own family stories with chapters that are more generically about the process behind genealogy research and the commercialization of ancestry through things like commercial DNA tests, for example. So that was really interesting. Even though I don't have family roots in the American South, I related to a lot of her experiences doing her family research. And then the other book is Rag and Bone, A Family History of What We've Thrown Away by Lisa Woolett. This book again mixes the author's kind of family genealogy research and stories and personal memoir with more general nonfiction chapters that are all related to what this author has collected while beachcombing and mudlarking, which is collecting little scraps of garbage and history out of the Thames River. And so she takes some specific items that she's found and kind of relates it to social history. And then she feeds that information into a broader discussion about consumption and environmentalism. And then Grace asks, what part of Canada do you live in? So I live in British Columbia, which is the westernmost province in Canada. I grew up on Vancouver Island, but now I live in the Rocky Mountains. And Sandra asked, what and where did you study? So I studied at a university in Ontario and then moved back to British Columbia after I graduated. And my bachelor's degree was in political science with a double minor in history and African studies. And then my master's degree was in international affairs with specializations in African studies and international development policy. And then both Megan and Amanda asked about how I met my husband. So Megan asked, you've talked a little bit about how you met your husband, but I'd be curious to hear more about the story. And Amanda asked, how did you and your husband meet? And so that is how I'm going to close out this Q&A video. I actually have our wedding picture in the background there, so that's very appropriate. And that is actually my wedding bouquet, because we did get married in Zambia. And I wasn't sure, I really wanted to have blue hydrangeas in my wedding bouquet, and I just wasn't positive that I'd be able to procure them. In Zambia, it's actually, we got married in July, which is the winter time in Zambia, and I was just nervous about finding the flowers that I wanted. So we actually had a big trip to Michael's and got some fake flowers and put together the bouquets from those fake flowers so they could be exactly what I wanted, which was blue hydrangeas and succulents. And now I get to have my wedding bouquet up as decor for the rest of my life, which is a really fun perk to doing a fake flower bouquet. But our story in a nutshell is that I was living in Zambia while I was doing my master's degree. I was doing an internship there, and I was living with some American students who were also interning at the same organization, and we were living and working in the capital city of Lusaka. And so one of the long weekends, we decided we were sick of city life and we wanted to kind of have an adventure and go down to Livingstone, which is more known as the tourist capital of Zambia. It's a launching point for a lot of safaris, and it's also the location of Victoria Falls, which are obviously the world famous waterfalls that are considered one of the 7 wonders of the natural world. But because there was a couple of us trying to coordinate our vacation plans, and it was a long weekend and we left our planning until too late, we couldn't secure spots at kind of the most commonly booked tourist hostels. in Livingston, so we ended up booking ourselves at this random lodge we found on the internet that was a little bit away out of town, which was very providential. So we took an intercity bus from Lusaka to Livingston. It's kind of like a Greyhound style bus. It's about a 7-hour bus ride. When my husband drives it, it's like 4 hours, but when you're in a big bus and having to make stops and load and offload luggage, it becomes more like 6 or 7 hours. So we get off the bus and there's lots of people clambering around, unloading their luggage. And because we're booked at this lodge a little ways out of town, we can't just walk to our accommodation, we have to take a taxi. And so we choose a taxi at random. There's a number of taxi cabs lined up. We choose one at random and we get in, and there is a very handsome and very sweet taxi driver there. And he drives us to the location, and in Zambia taxis aren't metered. You're supposed to kind of haggle for the price or just pay what they tell you to pay. And so we arrived at the lodge and he told us it would be 50 kwacha, but there was 4 of us. And so we were like, we're gonna give you 40 kwacha because that's 10 each and it's easy to do the math that way. And we had just been really ripped off by our taxi in Lusaka to get to the bus station. He'd way overcharged us, so we were in like a bad mood in general. And then this taxi driver was just so sweet. And when we said we'd pay him 40 kwacha, he just said, okay. And we took his phone number and we ended up using him and his taxi for the rest of our long weekend. Whenever we needed to get anywhere in town, he would take us and show us around, and kind of acted as a little bit of an honorary tour guide in addition to being our driver for the weekend. And so we kind of started chatting about different things while he was showing us Victoria Falls and the museum in Livingston. And yeah, we just started talking more, and that ended up being my husband. So reader, I married him. And that is the story of how my husband and I met, all because we were late in booking our accommodation and couldn't book the youth hostel that was right beside the bus station and needed to take a taxi to our lodge. And yeah, that is how we met. We ended up dating long distance for 2 years after I went home from the end of my internship. And then we got married in Zambia, like I said, and then had to do the immigration process to bring him to Canada, which took another year. And now he's been in Canada for 3.5 years, and we're going to be celebrating our 5-year wedding anniversary this year, which sounds kind of crazy. I can't believe we've already been married this long. It's starting to be long enough that when I go back and look at our wedding pictures, it's like, wow, we looked really young. So that's kind of cool. And so that is the story of how I met my husband. And that is also the end of my Q&A. I think this is going to be an atrociously long video. It looks like I've been filming for 2 hours, so we'll see how much I can whittle down when editing. But hopefully you enjoyed listening to me ramble on and answer all the wonderful questions. Thank you so much to everyone who left me a question, and thank you again for helping me reach the 500 subscriber milestone. And it definitely made me think about some aspects of my reading life that I hadn't really considered before, so that was really fun as well. So thank you so much for watching if you've stuck it out all the way to the end of this video, and until next time, enjoy wandering through the pages of a good book. Bye.